My name is Olivia, and I am 28. And if you met me today, you would probably assume I grew up with a sense of control, confidence, and clarity about my place in the world. But the truth is far more complicated, shaped by years of quiet frustration, unspoken rivalry, and the kind of family loyalty that feels more like a chain than a bond, especially when it comes to my brother, Ethan, who is 2 years older than me and has always believed that being the eldest automatically made him the rightful leader of everything our family touched, including the company our parents built from scratch long before either of us could spell the word business. Growing up, he was the loud one, the assertive one, the child who announced what game we were playing and who would be the hero or the villain. And I was the quiet kid in the corner who watched, learned, listened, and slowly developed a habit of observing people in a way that made adults think I was wise and made kids think I was strange. But that habit of observation later became my hidden strength, the thing that allowed me to understand how power actually worked in our family's company, a company that was large enough to matter, but small enough that emotions still leaked into every decision. Our parents raised us with almost opposite expectations. Ethan was told he would lead the company one day, and I was told I would find my way anywhere, which was loving but vague, and it quietly pushed me toward independence and education, two things that would later give me more leverage than I ever expected. After college, I didn't join the company right away. I worked at 2 different firms to build my own skills because I never wanted to be seen as someone who got her position through family ties. Meanwhile, Ethan walked directly into our company and moved through departments with the enthusiasm of someone who believed every step was destiny. While he was earning experience through exposure, I was earning experience through responsibility. But our parents never openly compared us because they believed we would eventually figure out our dynamic. What they didn't understand was that Ethan had already decided what the dynamic would be. He would rule, and I would orbit around whatever he built. When our father got sick 3 years ago, everything shifted. He stepped back, my mother followed his pace, and conversations about succession suddenly mattered more. In an unexpected decision, one that shocked even me, my father quietly transferred 70% of his ownership to me because he believed in my long-term vision, steadiness, and ability to protect the company from ego-driven leadership. But he made me promise not to interfere until he fully stepped down. And because I trusted him, I agreed. He wanted Ethan to have his chance to grow, to prove himself, and he didn't want the siblings to fight. So for almost 2 years, I kept the secret, carrying the weight of a truth that could have changed every conversation we had as a family, including the times Ethan spoke to me like I was someone who should stay in her lane and let him handle the big moves. I stayed calm, quiet, patient, exactly as my father asked, while Ethan grew bolder, sharper, and more controlling. When our father officially stepped down and Ethan was appointed as the new director, he acted like he had finally claimed the throne he believed was always his. He didn't know that the throne he sat on was actually mine. He didn't know that the real power wasn't in titles, but in ownership. And he definitely didn't know that I had spent these years preparing myself, not for a fight, but for a future where the company would be led by someone who understood people instead of dominating them. My first day officially joining the company was supposed to be simple: meet the team, settle into my office, and start understanding where I could contribute the most. I arrived early, wearing a calm confidence that made even the receptionist smile at me as if she could sense I was someone who moved differently. But before I could take more than a few steps inside, an assistant approached me and said I was needed in the boardroom for Ethan's first meeting as director. I walked in to find nearly 20 people seated around a long polished table, all wearing expressions that mixed excitement with uncertainty. Ethan stood at the front, shoulders back, chin lifted, the kind of posture he used when he wanted to feel taller than he actually was. He didn't even wait for me to sit down before he launched into his speech. Today, he said loudly, marks the beginning of a new era. My first decision as a leader is to fire anyone who doesn't add value. I don't care who they are or what their last name is. His eyes landed on me intentionally, like he had practiced the line in the mirror. Then he added, with a smirk that even the blinds seemed to squint at, "That includes you, sis." The room went painfully still. Some people looked away. Some looked down. A few looked like they wanted to slide under the table. I felt no embarrassment, only a calmness that came from knowing something no one else in that room did. I stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for Ethan to believe he had cornered me. Then I said, in the softest voice in the room, "Interesting, because as the owner of 72% of the company, your first decision was also your last." There was a ripple of gasps, the kind that come from people realizing the floor beneath them isn't as stable as they thought. Ethan blinked hard, once, twice, like he was trying to reboot his understanding of reality. He started stuttering something about authority and leadership, but I kept my voice steady and calm. "Sit down, Ethan," I said. Not angry, not loud, just firm. "We need to talk." And that, right there, was the moment everything shifted. Not because I embarrassed him, not because I revealed the truth, but because I finally stepped into the role I had been preparing for in silence. A role he never expected, but one I earned. Before I continue with what happened next, how the board reacted, how Ethan tried to fight back, and how I navigated the storm that followed, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge for more slow burn, thoughtful revenge stories told with clarity and calm strength. As Ethan slowly lowered himself into the chair, his jaw tight and his eyes darting between me and the board members, I could feel the tension in the room thickening like fog. But I stayed exactly as calm as I had been the moment I walked in, because I had spent years preparing for this. Not in the dramatic sense of plotting revenge, but in the quiet, steady sense of learning how to read people, how to manage conflict, and how to stand firm without shouting. Still, even with all that preparation, there was a part of me that felt a pang of sadness because this wasn't how I ever imagined things would unfold between us. Not on his first day, not in front of people who had dedicated years of their lives to our family's company. For several long seconds, no one moved, and the silence felt like a weight pressing against the walls. Then the oldest board member, Mr. Whitaker, cleared his throat and said, as gently as possible, "Olivia, perhaps you can explain." I nodded, not for permission, but as a sign of respect. "Of course," I said, my voice steady. "My father transferred majority ownership to me 3 years ago. He believed it was necessary to protect the company, and he trusted that I would reveal this information when the time was right." The room reacted in small, at telling ways, eyes widening, shoulders tightening. Subtle glances exchanged like unspoken questions flying from one person to another. Ethan, however, reacted in the most predictable way possible. He slammed his palm on the table. "This is ridiculous. Dad would never choose you over me. I've been running the departments. I've been leading. You've been trying to dominate," I said calmly. And even though the words were sharp, I delivered them gently, without bitterness. Leadership isn't about barking orders or firing people you don't understand. It's about building something that lasts. I wasn't there to humiliate him, and I certainly didn't enjoy seeing him unravel, but I also wasn't going to step back after everything my father trusted me with. I handed Mr. Whitaker the documents my father had signed, neatly stored in a folder I kept with me since the day he called me into his study and told me, in a tired but loving voice, "Promise me you'll protect the company from ego." "Liv." Mr. Whitaker put on his glasses, scanned the documents, then slowly passed them round a table. Each board member looked more convinced than the last. Some nodded slightly at me. Some avoided Ethan's gaze entirely. When the folder finally reached Ethan, he flipped through the pages with stiff, angry movements, as if the paper itself had betrayed him. "This doesn't mean anything," he said, but his voice was cracking. "I'm the director. I make the decisions." "No," I replied softly, "you were appointed director because our parents believed you needed the responsibility to grow. But ownership outranks title, and you tried to fire me on my first day." A couple of people shifted uncomfortably, not because I was wrong, but because the truth was painful to witness. Ethan stood up again, pacing, running his hands through his hair like he was trying to tear the situation apart with his fingers. "So, what are you going to do?" he finally asked, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and fear. "Kick me out? Throw me away like I'm nothing?" And that, right there, was the moment where the anger in me softened. He was my brother. He was flawed, arrogant, reckless, but he was still the boy I used to build forts with in our backyard. The boy who shared snacks with me after school. The boy who once proudly declared that he would always protect me because he was the older one. I took a slow breath. "Ethan," I said, "I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to save the company. And right now, you need help, not power." He blinked, confused. "I'm offering you a position," I said, "one where you can actually learn, one where you won't be able to hurt the people who work here." His face turned red with frustration. "A demotion, a correction," I replied, "because firing people as your first decision was reckless, and targeting me made it personal." The board murmured agreement under their breaths. Even those who respected Ethan couldn't deny what had just happened. Ethan sank back into his chair, deflated. For the first time, he looked small, not in size, but in understanding. He whispered, barely audible, "Dad should have told me." I held his gaze gently. "He didn't because he hoped you grow into the role without needing to be controlled." That truth seemed to hit him harder than anything else. It wasn't me he felt betrayed by. It was the idea that our father doubted him. Mr. Whitaker leaned forward. "Olivia, what do you propose?" "First," I said, "I'm dissolving Athens' authority to fire anyone unilaterally." A few people exhaled with visible relief. "Second, I'll take over the role of interim director until further assessment." Ethan shot up again. "No, I can learn. I had a bad start." "You threatened to fire your own sister," one board member muttered under his breath. Another added, and half the room looked terrified. Ethan looked around, seeing the truth in their expressions. His shoulders dropped. "What do you want me to do?" he asked me, quietly now. "Start over," I said gently. "Learn, shadow the people who know how to run departments without fear, build real relationships, earn respect instead of demanding it." For a long moment, I thought he might refuse, might storm out, might erupt again. But then something unexpected happened. He nodded, not out of defeat, but out of a tiny, fragile understanding. "Fine," he said. "I'll try." The meeting slowly dissolved into side conversations as the decision became clear. I was stepping in. Ethan was stepping back, and the company was entering a new chapter. As people filed out, some approached me quietly to say things like "thank you" or "this was needed" or "your father chose well." I appreciated every word, but my mind stayed on Ethan, who remained in his seat, staring at the polished table like it held the answers he spent his whole life chasing. When the room finally emptied, I sat beside him. "This doesn't have to be the worst day of your life," I said softly. "It can be the first day you realign yourself." He said heavily, "I really messed up, didn't I?" "Yes," I said honestly, "but messing up isn't the end. Staying the same is." He didn't look at me, but he nodded slightly, and that was enough for now. What none of us realized then was that this moment, this quiet shift, was only the beginning of a much deeper conflict, one that would test not only our roles in the company, but our bond as siblings, and the lengths people would go when pride and power collide. Before I share how the next days unfolded, how the company responded, and how Athens' insecurity spiraled into choices that forced me to take firmer actions, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge for more thoughtful, slow-burn revenge stories told with clarity and calm strength. In the days that followed that intense boardroom meeting, the atmosphere inside the company shifted in subtle but undeniable ways, and although I carried myself calmly, almost serenely, I felt a constant undercurrent of responsibility running through me, because stepping into leadership wasn't just about taking a title or exercising authority. It was about untangling months, even years, of poor decisions that had quietly piled up under Ethan's watch while everyone tried to stay respectful to the family legacy. I spent the first morning simply walking through every department, greeting people by name when I recognized them, asking gentle questions, listening more than I spoke, and observing the tension in their shoulders slowly ease as they realized I wasn't there to demand performance or threaten consequences like Ethan had done during his rushed climb toward power. Some employees even whispered a quick congratulations or thank you for yesterday, though they said it softly, as if they feared the walls might repeat their words back to Ethan. Meanwhile, he kept to himself, mostly staying inside the office he was temporarily keeping. Though stripped of authority, it now felt more like a waiting room than a workspace. The first challenge came from HR, where the director approached me with a thick folder and a very uncomfortable expression. "We've had complaints," she said, lowering her voice. "About?" I asked, though I already had a feeling. "Your brother," she said carefully. "Before he became director, he pushed several employees to resign, and during his short time leading certain departments, he intimidated others into silence. Some were too afraid to speak until now." Hearing that didn't shock me, but it still stung, not because I wanted to defend his behavior, but because it meant things had been worse than I realized. I took the folder, thanked her, and spent the rest of the day reading through testimonies pages filled with descriptions of Ethan's temper, his impatience, his constant need to prove himself, his refusal to collaborate, and his tendency to treat every disagreement like a personal attack. The more I read, the more obvious it became that Ethan wasn't malicious, he was insecure, desperately so, and the insecurity had turned into behavior that bordered on destructive. That night, when everyone had gone home, I knocked on his office door. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked exhausted, like the weight of reality had finally begun to settle onto his shoulders. "I heard you've been busy," he said without bitterness, just resignation. "And I heard you've been avoiding everyone," I replied softly. He shrugged. "No one wants to talk to the guy who tried to fire half the company. They're scared of the version of you that was leading with fear," I said. "Not the version of you that can learn." He let out a humorless laugh. "Guess I ruined that version before it had a chance." I sat down across from him. "You haven't ruined anything. You started wrong. And you tried to prove something so badly that you forgot how leadership actually works." He rubbed his eyes with both hands. "So what now? You going to fire me?" "No," I said firmly, "but I'm going to hold you accountable." He looked up then, curious and cautious at the same time. "Which means you're going to spend the next few months working under department heads who know what they're doing. You'll shadow people who have earned respect. You'll learn how to handle conflict without blowing up, and you'll rebuild trust slowly." Ethan scoffed. "People hate me, they fear you," I corrected. "And fear can become respect if you're willing to change. But if you don't change, fear becomes resentment, and resentment destroys everything." He didn't argue, and for the first time, I saw something fragile flicker in his eyes, not anger, not defensiveness, but the raw awareness of someone realizing they weren't the hero in their own story. The next morning, I began meeting with department heads to assess the damage Ethan had done, and while most of them were professional, some were brutally honest. "He treated us like children," one manager told me. "He barked orders. He didn't listen." Another said, "Your brother has potential, but he needs discipline, not power." And the harshest one, "Your father groomed him for leadership, but he wasn't ready." You were. It was strange, hearing people speak about us like characters in a story they'd been forced to watch unfold. And though part of me felt validated, another part felt heavy with responsibility. I didn't want to replace Ethan in a way that broke him. I wanted to help him become someone who didn't need to act powerful just to feel valued. Over the following week, I set up a detailed structure. Ethan would rotate through operations, finance, HR, marketing, and logistics. Each rotation would last 2 weeks, and at the end of each period, The department head would submit an evaluation. He didn't love the plan. He resisted at first. He complained, but he didn't refuse. And that was enough. Meanwhile, I threw myself into leadership quietly but firmly. I fixed workflow issues. I reinstated employees Ethan had pushed out. I implemented new communication guidelines. I increased transparency in decision-making. And with every day that passed, the company began to breathe easier, like a pressure valve had been loosened. But the problem wasn't the company adjusting, it was Ethan adjusting. And that part was messy. During his first rotation in operations, he clashed with the team lead, who later told me privately, "Your brother is trying." But he gets defensive the moment he feels corrected. In finance, he shut down when someone challenged one of his assumptions. In HR, he apologized so stiffly that it almost made things worse. And in marketing, he had a meltdown when someone joked lightly about his director fees. Every night he went home frustrated, feeling like the world was against him. But every morning he showed up again, and I respected that more than he knew. What I didn't expect, though, was how other people reacted to his struggle. Some employees softened toward him, seeing glimpses of sincerity. Others kept their distance. A few openly doubted he would ever change. And one person or senior manager named Carla pulled me aside one afternoon. "Be careful," she said quietly. "Your brother is trying, yes, but people who feel cornered can become unpredictable." I didn't want to believe that. I didn't want to think Ethan could ever turn against me in a harmful way. But the way she said it stayed in my mind, like a warning I couldn't shake. And within days, I would learn she was right, not because Ethan intended to sabotage me, but because someone else did. Someone who saw his vulnerability as a doorway to manipulate him. Someone who had been waiting for a moment like this to challenge my role and push the company into chaos. Before I dive into how that person stepped into the picture, how their influence fueled Ethan's insecurity, and how the situation escalated into the biggest conflict our company had ever faced, remember to like, share, and subscribe to my calm revenge for more detailed, calm, and emotionally rich revenge stories. What I didn't realize at the time, something that would only become painfully clear in the weeks that followed, was that Ethan wasn't the only one struggling with the shift in leadership. Some people inside the company saw my steady rise and calm authority not as stability, but as a threat to their own ambitions. And among them, the quietest but most calculating was a man named Victor Hale, the head of finance, a person who had worked under my father for almost 15 years, and who had grown used to operating in the shadows, pushing numbers, influencing budgets, and silently shaping decisions without ever being in the spotlight. But now, with me taking a more active role and reviewing every department, including finance, he found himself under a kind of scrutiny he wasn't used to. And rather than adapt like Ethan was trying to, Victor decided to resist, but not openly. He chose a different strategy, one that involved using my brother's insecurity as a tool. I first sensed something was off when Ethan began acting strangely after his finance rotation. He wouldn't look at me during meetings. He avoided eye contact. And when I tried to ask him how his evaluation went, he shrugged and said, "Fine." But his tone was stiff and cold, nothing like the fragile willingness he had been demonstrating before. Later that evening, when the office was quiet and I was reviewing documents, I passed by the conference room and saw Ethan sitting with Victor, their heads close together, speaking in low voices. The sight made my stomach twist, because Victor was never the type to work late. Unless there was something in it for him, he was efficient, predictable, and intentionally distant from most employees. So seeing him investing time in my brother felt wrong, like a puzzle piece that didn't belong. I didn't interrupt them, but I watched from a distance, unnoticed. And what struck me most wasn't the conversation itself, but the way Ethan's shoulders were hunched, like someone had been feeding his doubts until they grew heavy enough to bend him. The next morning confirmed my suspicion. During a meeting with department heads, Ethan suddenly challenged me, something he hadn't done since the board confrontation. When I presented a new transparency policy, he cut in sharply. And how do we know this isn't just you consolidating more control? His tone wasn't angry, but it was laced with something unfamiliar, something rehearsed. The room fell silent. A few people looked from him to me, waiting to see how I'd respond. I met his eyes calmly. This policy is about accountability, not control, I said. It protects everyone, including you, or it puts all the power in your hands, he countered. And the way he said it made me realize someone had planted that thought in him. And I knew exactly who. After the meeting, I pulled him aside. What's going on? I asked gently. Nothing, he said too quickly. You're treating me like a child. Maybe Victor is right, you don't trust me. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they weren't his. They belonged to someone else. Ethan, I said softly, what did Victor tell you? He stiffened. He didn't tell me anything. He just listens. That was the problem. Victor didn't counsel, he manipulated. I tried to keep my voice steady. Be careful who you trust right now. Funny, he said bitterly. Victor said the same thing about you. And with that, he walked away. The next week became a quiet war. One fought not with shouting or dramatic confrontations, but with subtle shifts in behavior, whispered conversations, conflicting suggestions, and small acts of defiance that chipped away at the progress Ethan had been making. Victor began requesting private meetings with board members, always under the guise of financial reviews. But word eventually got back to me that he was implying I was taking control too aggressively, that the company needed balanced leadership, that perhaps someone else, someone more seasoned, should be guiding Ethan into his rightful role. In other words, he was positioning himself as that someone. I didn't confront him immediately because rash reactions give manipulators more ammunition, but I watched him carefully, observing how he operated, how he leaned in close to people when speaking, how he framed his suggestions as concerns, how he always made himself seem reasonable while planting seeds of doubt one by one. Meanwhile, Ethan's behavior grew worse. During his rotation in HR, he clashed with the director again. But this time he accused her of favoring me, even though she was simply enforcing structure. In marketing, he dismissed feedback with an arrogance he hadn't shown since before the board meeting. When I tried to talk to him, he shut down emotionally, throwing phrases at me that were clearly borrowed from Victor's philosophy, things like power imbalance, structural control, and authority consolidation. Words Ethan never used naturally. The situation reached a tipping point when I reviewed a financial audit my father had started before he became ill, one that examined the movement of departmental funds. Buried deep within the audit were anomalies, small, consistent transfers that didn't match expense reports. At first, I assumed it was carelessness or outdated accounting practices, but when I cross-checked the data, one name appeared repeatedly. Victor. The numbers weren't large enough to be called embezzlement, at least not yet, but they were certainly manipulation, money being shifted between budgets to create the illusion of departmental instability or to make certain areas appear more profitable under his guidance. It was the kind of financial smoke and mirror tactic that could easily be used to sway board decisions. My father must have seen something before he got sick, but he hadn't finished the audit. And no one else had noticed, or no one else had dared to raise concerns. I knew confronting him without preparation would be dangerous, not physically, but politically. People like Victor didn't panic, they retaliated. So instead, I quietly began gathering evidence. I worked late nights pulling old financial records, cross-referencing data, double-checking spreadsheets, contacting to external auditors my father had trusted, and building a timeline of irregularities. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that Victor's ambition wasn't new, it had been growing for years, fed by my father's declining health and Ethan's instability. And with me stepping into leadership, he must have realized his window of influence was closing fast. One night, while printing documents, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Ethan, looking conflicted, his expression flickering between frustration and guilt. Victor said, "You're trying to get rid of him," he said quietly. He said, "You're creating drama to push out people who don't agree with you." I took a slow breath. And do you believe that I don't know? He admitted. He said you manipulated Dad into giving you the majority share. The accusation hurt more than anything else so far, not because it was true, it wasn't, but because it showed how deeply Victor had sunk his claws into him. Ethan, I said softly, Dad gave me the majority because he knew you weren't ready. That isn't manipulation. That's a parent trying to protect both of us. He didn't respond. He stared at the floor, torn between loyalty and confusion. I wished, in that moment, that I could protect him from everything, from Victor, from his own insecurities, from the weight of expectations he never learned to carry. But I couldn't do it for him. He had to choose, and he wasn't choosing yet. What happened the following week forced everything into the open. A financial report suddenly leaked to several board members, one that falsely suggested I had misallocated company funds. The moment I saw it, I knew it was fabricated. Victor had altered the numbers just enough to cause doubt, but not enough to be easily disproven. It was a trap, and a strategic one. He wanted the board to question my authority. He wanted them to doubt my decisions. He wanted them to see him as the steady hand guiding Ethan. But he did not expect me to already have months of evidence documenting his manipulations. Before I reveal how I confronted him, how Ethan reacted, how the board meeting exploded into the most tense moment of our family's business history, and how calm, deliberate revenge unfolded from there. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge for more patient, detailed, and emotionally grounded revenge stories told with clarity and empathy. As the days rolled into weeks after that tense turning point, the atmosphere in my life thickened with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. Because even though Julie had tried to reclaim control over me, I felt something inside myself refusing to bow again. And that quiet rebellion grew stronger every time I replayed his threats in my mind. Every time I heard the echo of his voice telling me I would never rise above him. Every time I remembered the coldness in his eyes as he tried to make me fold the way I used to. But that old version of me was gone. And as I continued running the warehouse with a new determination, new customers began pouring in, new contracts began forming, and slowly the weight of Julian's influence over my life began to feel smaller, like a shadow shrinking at the edge of my world. Though deep down I knew that shrinking shadow wasn't gone yet, because people like him never leave quietly. They circle, they wait, they search for moments of weakness. But what he didn't know was that I had begun rebuilding myself piece by piece, strengthening not just my business, but my mindset, my boundaries, and my understanding of my own worth. And that strength began reflecting in everything I touched. The warehouse operations became smoother. My employees seemed to respect me in a new way. Opportunities I once thought were far beyond my reach started appearing in my inbox. And every night as I locked the office and walked to my car with the glow of the security lights above me, I felt a growing fire, a promise to myself that no one, especially not Julian, would ever bring me back to a place of fear and submission again. But life, as always, is never satisfied with calm progress. And one chilly morning, when I arrived at the warehouse earlier than usual, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar even though I had triple-checked it the night before, and that sinking heaviness in my stomach told me this was not an accident. And the moment I stepped inside and saw boxes scattered on the floor, paperwork tossed around, and my office drawers pulled open, I knew someone had broken in, not to steal anything valuable but to send a message wrapped in disruption, chaos, and intimidation. And although I didn't want to admit it at first, every part of me whispered the same name, Julie, and because this act felt calculated, too personal, too targeted to be random vandalism. And as I walked deeper inside, assessing the damage, I found nothing missing except a single folder that contained copies of my largest contract, and the realization that someone had taken only that made my heart hammer with both anger and fear. Because this wasn't just intimidation, This was sabotage, the kind that could collapse everything I had worked for, the kind that could make my clients question my reliability, the kind that could destroy the one part of my life Julian had always hated: my independence. Still, in that moment of chaos, something within me hardened, because fear used to be the thing that controlled me. But now it was something I examined, something I understood, and instead of panicking, I called the police, documented everything, and immediately contacted the client to explain the situation before Julian could twist the narrative. And to my relief, the client believed me, even commending me for my immediate honesty. But as soon as I hung up the phone, a new thought struck me. If Julian was desperate enough to break into my warehouse and steal something that couldn't even benefit him financially, then he was spiraling, losing control, and people who lose control become 10 times more dangerous. Still, even with that danger creeping closer, my courage didn't falter. And that became my greatest advantage, because when Julian attempted to call me later that day, his voice sickeningly calm as he pretended to check on me after hearing about the break-in, I finally spoke to him with a firmness he had never heard from me before, telling him plainly that I knew what he had done and that any further interference in my life would have legal consequences. And the silence that followed my words felt like the first crack appearing in the wall of power he had always hidden behind, a wall built from manipulation, control, and my once fragile self-esteem. After that call, I expected him to lash out immediately, but instead, Julian became unnervingly quiet, as if retreating into the shadows to rethink his next move. And though the silence should have comforted me, it only brought more tension, more questions, and more sleepless nights. Because a man like Julian never surrenders. He plots, he waits for you to let your guard down. He watches from angles you don't even know exist. And I knew that whatever he was planning next would not be small, not subtle, not ignorable. Still, even under that weight, I chose to continue running the warehouse with confidence, hiring better security, installing cameras in every blind spot, upgrading the locks, and even training my staff on emergency protocols. And each step I took to protect the business made me feel stronger, more solid, more capable, until one afternoon, as I was going through invoices in my office, my phone buzzed with a message that made the world around me tilt. A picture of me locking up the warehouse the night before, taken from across the street, time-stamped, and sent from an unknown number. And although I already knew who had sent it, the cold dread that spread through my chest forced me to face the truth. Julian wasn't just trying to damage my business anymore. He was watching me, tracking me, stalking my movements. And that escalation meant everything was about to reach a dangerous and unavoidable breaking point. One that would decide not only the future of my business, but the course of my entire life. The moment I saw that picture of myself locking the warehouse, frozen in time under the dim streetlight with the timestamp glowing beneath it, a cold numbness spread through me so quickly that for a few seconds I couldn't even blink. Because this wasn't just intimidation anymore, this was surveillance. This was obsession. This was Julian trying to squeeze his way back into every corner of my life like he used to when he controlled my every move. And as I stared at the image, my fingers trembling slightly, I realized that the game had changed completely. That what he wanted wasn't to ruin my business or sabotage a contract. What he wanted was to break me psychologically, to remind me that no matter how far I'd come, he could still watch me, still reach me, still haunt me in the shadows. But something inside me snapped in a different way this time, because instead of fear rising inside my chest, a heat spread through me, anger, sharp and steady, an anger that came from months of holding myself together, from years of letting him dictate the direction of my life, from the recent attacks that he expected would make me crumble. But I didn't crumble. Instead, I opened the security footage, saved the messages, called the detective handling the warehouse break-in, and sent everything, demanding immediate action, because this had moved beyond property damage into the realm of personal threat. And though the officer remained calm, his voice carried the seriousness of the situation, advising me to stay alert, avoid going anywhere alone, and consider filing for a restraining order. But even while listening, I knew that restraining orders often meant nothing to people like Julian, people who thrived on control, people who interpreted boundaries as challenges rather than limitations. Still, I followed the paperwork, my voice steady, my hands firm, because I refused to live in fear anymore. And that act alone felt like reclaiming another piece of myself that Julian had stolen long before. But deep down, despite all the legal steps, I knew one truth that terrified me more than any picture or threat. Julian wasn't finished, and his silence since the warehouse break-in felt like the quiet before a storm, the moment when the sky holds its breath before unleashing something catastrophic. Yet, even as the dread simmered inside me, life didn't stop. Orders still needed processing. Employees still looked to me for direction. Bills still had to be paid. Trucks still came for shipments. And every morning, I stood in the warehouse, forcing myself to act composed, even though every sound, every shadow near the entrance, every unfamiliar car outside sent a surge of tension through my spine. And my employees began to notice my heightened alertness, giving me glances filled with concern, though none of them knew the full truth, the depth of the danger creeping closer. But the real turning point came 3 nights later, when I was leaving the warehouse after a long, exhausting day, the winter air biting at my skin. And as I walked toward my car, I felt something shift in the atmosphere, like the world had fallen unnaturally quiet. And when I looked up, I saw a figure standing near the far end of the parking lot, not moving, not approaching, just standing in the shadows, his silhouette illuminated faintly by the reflection of the street lamp behind him. And though I couldn't see the face, I knew, with the same instinct that warns you of fire before seeing the flames, that it was Julian. My breath caught in my chest. My heartbeat thundered against my ribs. But instead of freezing or running the way I once would have, I pulled out my phone and started recording, raising it high so the camera captured him directly. And in that moment, the figure stepped back into the deeper shadows and then disappeared completely from sight. And although part of me felt shaken, another part of me felt strangely empowered, because Julian had expected me to panic, to lose control, to make myself small again. But I hadn't. I had confronted him with evidence, with confidence, with a refusal to be intimidated. And that shift in dynamic was something he hadn't predicted. Later that night, as I sat in my apartment with every door locked, every curtain drawn, reviewing the footage frame by frame, I realized something even more unsettling. Julian hadn't followed me to frighten me. He had shown himself because he wanted me to know he was near. He wanted me to feel watched. He wanted me to anticipate his next move. And people like him derived power from the fear they planted inside others. But he no longer understood that I wasn't the same person he once manipulated, and that misunderstanding was going to be his downfall. Still, I didn't underestimate him. Not for a second. And I began taking steps he never expected: meetings with a lawyer, consultations with private security firms, discussions with a former police officer who specialized in threat assessment. And each professional told me the same thing: Julian's behavior was escalating in a pattern that often ended with a confrontation, sometimes violent, always dangerous. But instead of letting the fear consume me, I channeled every ounce of anxiety into preparing myself, securing my home with reinforced locks, installing motion sensors, carrying a personal alarm, documenting everything in meticulous detail, and even alerting my neighbors so they could help keep an eye on unfamiliar cars. And through all this preparation, one truth became clear: Julian was losing control, not over me, but over himself. And when a man like him loses internal control, the external destruction becomes inevitable. And that inevitability finally materialized one stormy night when I was alone in the warehouse finishing some late inventory work, rain hammering against the windows, wind howling like something feral outside, when suddenly the power cut out, plunging the entire building into darkness so complete it felt like the air thickened. And for a moment, I stood frozen, listening to the eerie silence that followed the outage, until I heard a faint sound, a footstep somewhere in the back of the warehouse, soft but unmistakably human. And in that instant, I knew Julian was inside, not hiding outside anymore, not watching from a distance, but here, in the same space as me, closing the final gap he'd been narrowing for weeks, ready to force the confrontation he believed would break me once and for all. But what he didn't know, what he had never understood, was that I wasn't the victim he left behind years ago. I was someone rebuilt, sharpened, strengthened by every attempt he had made to tear me apart. And as my hand tightened around the flashlight and my breath steadied, I realized that this moment, this terrifying collision of past and present, would determine everything that happened next in my life. Whether I remained trapped in the shadow of who he used to be, or finally stepped into the version of myself I had been fighting to become. When I heard that soft, deliberate footstep echo through the dark warehouse, the air thick with humidity from the storm outside, and the silence almost unnatural, something inside me settled, not in fear, but in certainty, because I finally understood that Julian hadn't come here to talk or negotiate or threaten from a distance. He had come to force an ending, and I knew it was time for me to decide whether I would remain defined by everything he had done to me, or whether I would finally take full control of my own story. So I kept my breathing steady, held the flashlight tightly in my hand, and stepped slowly toward the faint sounds coming from the storage aisle, each footstep of mine sounding louder than it should have in the darkness, as if the building itself was holding its breath. And with each step, I replayed every moment that had led to this: the surveillance photos, the break-in, the shadow in the parking lot, the threats, the years of manipulation he had inflicted on me long before any of this even began. And instead of feeling intimidated, I felt strangely anchored, aware of myself in a way I had never been when Julian controlled the narrative. Suddenly another sound came, a quiet scrape against metal, and that's when I whispered, voice steady despite the pounding of my heart, "Julian, I know you're here." And for a moment there was no response, just unbroken darkness, until I heard his voice drift out from behind one of the shelving units, low and controlled, the same tone he used when we were children, and he wanted me to believe he was the only one who truly understood the world. And he said, "You should have stayed small, Olivia. You were easier to manage that way." And his words sent a strange calm through me, because I'd spent nearly my whole adult life shrinking myself so he wouldn't explode, wouldn't lash out, wouldn't tear me apart emotionally. And now, hearing that admission felt like a final confirmation of why I had to stand up to him now. So I raised the flashlight and stepped around the corner, illuminating him standing there with his shoulders hunched slightly forward, rainwater dripping from the hood of his jacket, his eyes sharp and wild like someone who had convinced himself he was the victim in all of this. And for a long moment neither of us moved. Then he took one step toward me, not aggressively, but with the confidence of someone who believed he still held power over me. And he said, "Do you really think the police will help you? They don't understand family. They don't understand loyalty." And the word loyalty coming from him almost made me laugh, because Julian had never been loyal to anyone but himself. And I replied evenly, "Loyalty isn't obedience, Julian. You just never learn the difference." And something flickered in his eyes: anger, disbelief, maybe even a hint of fear, because I wasn't speaking with the hesitation he expected. And before he could take another step, I added, "I documented everything, every message, every threat, every time you showed up near my home. You won't get to rewrite this." And he shook his head slowly, like he was disappointed in me, and said, "You think you're in control here?" But before I could answer, the warehouse lights flickered back to life, flooding the room with harsh white brightness, and he blinked rapidly, momentarily disoriented, giving me the seconds I needed to reach for my phone and hit the emergency call button linked directly to the police line. Julian snapped back to attention at the sight and made a move toward me, but it wasn't fast enough, because the moment he lunged, I stepped back and activated the personal alarm attached to my belt, a piercing, shrill sound exploding through the warehouse, echoing so loudly that even Julian recoiled, pressing his hands to his ears. And I ran toward the front of the building, not out of fear, but out of strategy, because I knew the alarm would draw attention from the neighboring units, and I wanted witnesses present when the police arrived. Behind me, I could hear Julian shouting something, but his words were swallowed by the alarm and the storm. And when I reached the main entrance, I pushed open the door and stepped into the rain-soaked parking lot just as two employees who had been working late in a nearby building rushed over asking if I was okay. And before I could answer, Julian stumbled out of the warehouse, looking furious and unhinged, and the employees immediately backed away, realizing something dangerous was unfolding. Within minutes, flashing lights appeared at the edge of the parking lot, growing brighter as two police cars pulled in, and Julian froze like an animal caught in headlights, his bravado collapsing under the weight of consequences he never believed would reach him. And when the officers approached, hands on their belts, calling out commands, Julian did what he always did. He tried to talk his way out of it, saying things like, "This is a misunderstanding," and "she's overreacting," and "we're family." But this time his words held no power, because the officers had already been briefed on everything I'd reported in the past weeks. They had the photos, the videos, the statements, and when I pointed at him and quietly said, "He broken," he threatened me. They moved in with calm efficiency, placing him in handcuffs as Julian shouted my name like I was betraying him instead of protecting myself. Watching him dragged away into the back of the police car didn't bring me satisfaction. Not really, but it brought closure, a feeling I had spent years believing I would never get in. After the officers took my statement and the parking lot finally emptied, I stood alone in the rain for a long moment, letting the storm wash away the last remnants of the fear he had planted in me. In the days that followed, everything shifted quickly. Julian was charged with multiple offenses. The restraining order became permanent, and his bail conditions barred him from coming near me, my home, or my business. And as word spread, employees expressed relief, some even admitting they had always felt uneasy around him, and business slowly returned to normal. But the biggest shift happened inside me, because for the first time in my life, I felt what it meant to be free, not just legally or physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually free from the weight of someone who had controlled me for far too long. And this freedom changed how I walked into my warehouse every morning, how I spoke in meetings, how I planned for the future. Eventually, I upgraded our entire security system, hired additional staff, expanded our operations, and even opened a second storage facility, something I'd dreamed of for years, but never pursued, because Julian had always convinced me I wasn't capable of more. And one quiet afternoon, months after his arrest, I found myself standing in the very same hall where the confrontation had happened, sunlight pouring through the windows, dust drifting lazily in the warm light, and I realized how symbolic this moment was. I was standing in the place where my life almost collapsed and yet had been rebuilt instead, stronger and calmer than before. And that's when I understood fully that revenge, at least the kind I believed in, wasn't about destroying someone else. It was about reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to steal, about rising without shouting, building without breaking, choosing peace over chaos, and proving through your actions that you survived what was meant to crush you. And as I locked up that evening and walked to my car with the quiet confidence I had earned through fire, I whispered to myself, "This is my life now." And the words felt honest and steady, like the final chapter of a story that had taken years to write. And when I finally drove away, the sun setting behind me, it wasn't fear or anger filling my chest. It was gratitude, strength, and the kind of calm victory that makes you realize you didn't just win back your safety or your business, you won back yourself. So if you've stayed with me through all of this, thank you, truly. And if you want more stories told in this calm, honest way, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my Calm Revenge, because there are many more stories to tell, and I would be honored to share them with you.